Jund Monsters deck.
Pretty straightforward stuff. Not even any of the new lands, not messing around with any land war waste or so forth. Pretty straightforward stuff.
Yep, I don't think Richey has added any M15 cards. He's going with the tried and true one. Lossett has souped up his mana a bit. He's now playing a couple of copies of Caves of Koilos in his deck. Otherwise, I'd say pretty standard list, so we're going to be underway here.
Caves is a significant upgrade for this deck, I think, potentially. I know when I'm playing games against Esper all the time, something that comes up is it's turn 3 and they're on something like Island Temple Mutavault, let's say.
Sure.
And I'm like, I'm not playing around Supreme Verdict because the odds that they have an untapped source of white mana next turn are just really low. I can ignore it. And that's a problem that Esper has all the time that blue-white control doesn't necessarily have. But Caves allows you just to have more access to untapped white mana on turn 4 to cast Supreme Verdict, or on turn 2 to play something like Devour Flesh or Azorius Charm.
Yeah, that's been one of my big selling points of blue-white, is that I need the turn 4 Verdict. Underway here, Joe's on the play with the Temple. He had 2 lands, but one of the scariest starts for control did happen on Richey's side. He started with a turn 1 Elvish Mystic and had the turn 2 Domri Rod. It didn't hit, but that's not really the problem. Lossett is going to have the Detention Sphere for it.
So now Joe also showing that he's not on the planar cleansing build of control. He is playing with Detention Spheres and most likely Banishing Lights as well.
Yeah, usually it's somewhere around 4 or 5. He has the 4 spheres. Does not look like he has any Banishing Lights in his deck. But yeah, usually you see somewhere between 0 and 2 Banishing Lights in a list that has Sphere in it. My guess is actually once you see them playing Esper, I would assume they don't have the Banishing Lights because it's hard to find room for Banishing Lights and black cards.
Sure.
You know, he has 3 Thoughtseize in that kind of flex spot. Richey with a replacement Domri, though, on his turn. It's going to go ahead and find Courser of Krufix. And Jund just can attack on so many different angles. Each of its, as we see here, he's going to have a Mutavault, which Lossett has to take care of, a Domri, which is a Planeswalker, and then he has a utility creature that gains value while in play. It's like a bunch of problems all at once here.
Now, that said, even if Richard's generating card advantage and playing these problematic cards for Joe that you're mentioning, if Richard doesn't also tax Joe's life total, it could all be for naught, because cards like Elspeth and Sphinx's Revelation, Supreme Verdict, they can overpower these kind of exchanges.
Yeah, he has to still win. He can't just draw cards. Lossett had a second Detention Sphere. Richey putting him to the test. He has a third Domri. And swings in for 1 as Lossett down to 17.
So is this start good or bad for Joe? I don't know. It depends if he keeps making land drops, but he isn't necessarily out of this game by any stretch, though missing a land drop here is very bad for him.
Yeah, you want to hit land 6, or you don't want to miss a land for the first 7 turns or so. It's still fine. Like, he can let Domri tick up for a while. The Jund player can draw cards. As long as Joe's keeping the board clean, he can let Richey draw cards for a while. Like I said, I like that Dissolve on Courser, mainly because I want to scry one, but also because I don't want to, if I were the control player, I don't want to get like 2 permanents behind. Because once Richey has something like Domri and, say, a Courser, now it's like, well, how do you deal with that, right? You'd have to have Last Breath plus Detention Sphere. You'd have to cast 2 spells, and that's pretty hard because you don't have something like Planar Cleansing.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, second Elvish Mystic for Richey, and has 5 lands here, a pair of Mutavaults. Joe did hit his 5th land, passes back the turn. He does have at least 1 Revelation in his hand. Opted not to Supreme Verdict there either, which I like.
I think he needs to extract a little more value out of it than this. He's behind in the resource battle by so much that I don't think he can just fire it off on 2 Elvish Mystics.
Yeah. Domri not finding much for Richey, but it is at 6. Remember, at 7 is when it gets ultimate. And Lossett not playing an Elixir build, which can make it very difficult to win through a Domri emblem. Stormbreath Dragon is a play for Richey. No counterspell for Joe, and it's going to be Mutavault and Stormbreath swinging in. That's for 6. And an end-step Rev for 2 from Lossett.
And Joe just needs action here. He can't really afford to wait for more lands for a bigger Rev.
Yeah, he needs to hit more lands. I think this is going to draw out the Supreme Verdict. He did draw a Thoughtseize for the turn. That actually like that drop fairly well because he can, I believe, Thoughtseize and Verdict.
Yeah, his mana allows it. He can pull it off.
Yeah, there's still this thing of this Domri's about to ultimate, and he's gonna have to deal with that. But and then, like I said, there's just a lot of angles, right? Joe needs to clean the board. He needs to get rid of the Domri, and he has to take care of the fact that Richey has 2 Mutavaults. And basically, each of these problems requires a card for Joe to solve it. And it's not certain whether he can even cast cards fast enough to take care of all of those.
I think all these problems could be solvable if it weren't for the Mutavaults, but I think that's the final.
That's the nail.
There's just too much going on, too many different angles of attack.
All right, we see Richey's hand. It is Gorklan Rampager, 2nd Stormbreath Dragon, and Ultimate Price. Ultimate Price, not a problem. I think he's pretty priced into taking the Stormbreath. He's going to this, and he plays the Verdict with the Thoughtseize. There's some danger here. Richey can put Joe down to 1 with a land here on that Gorklan Rampager.
Or you just kill him. That's another option. He has an untapped land here.
Yeah, if he has an untapped land, he can kill him. He draws a 2nd Gorklan Rampager. I don't believe he does, so Lossett's got some time. But the thing is that, and this is like where I said it takes a bunch of mana to answer all of Richey's things. You know, Lossett needs a Detention Sphere, and then he needs enough mana to take care of both Mutavaults on the next swing.
Oh, never mind.
He does have the untapped land. Okay, well, that should be lethal. Activates Mutavault, swings, and pumps at 10. And that'll do. Richey takes game 1.
Good enough.
Joe checking to make sure, yeah, you have the mana to do that. Yep, looks like you do. And we're on to the 2nd game.
And that was a good clinic on what Jund Monsters can do, at least in the games where it has Domri. Early on against Esper Control. I think without the 3rd Planeswalker there, Joe may be able to kind of trade 1 for 1 and stabilize, but as you mentioned, so many different angles of attack that game.
Yeah, I think one of the appealing parts about playing Jund Monsters is that its control matchup's not, really isn't half bad. Joe really can't get behind more than 2 threats at any point because all his answers are just 1 for 1 and cost 2 and usually 3 mana, Dissolve, Detention Sphere. It's hard for him to catch up.
And a lot of it requires him to tap out on his own turn.
Right.
And given how much haste is in the deck, or haste and Planeswalkers and Mutavaults and all that kind of stuff, tapping out's a huge cost.
Yeah, so going over to Joe's board. Joe has really embraced the man plan sideboard. He has 4 Night Veils. Those don't work in this matchup, but he has a full 4 Archangel of Thune in his sideboard, which that's a huge amount of Archangel. I'm wondering whether or not he uses them in this matchup.
Archangel seems pretty well suited. It's hard to play the pure control game against Jund, I feel like. For kind of the reasons you were mentioning during the game, there's so many different angles of attack, and the threats that Jund produces all require immediate responses. You can't wait to set up these Supreme Verdicts that are 4 for 1s and so forth. So I think he is going to want to bring them in.
Yeah, he had some cheaper removal too, which is going to be helpful. He has 2 Pithing Needle and 2 Ultimate Price. Those I imagine all of those will come in. But yeah, it's rather than trying to play the control game, it looks like his board plan is to just try to turn the corner with a creature of his own.
Yeah, makes sense. On Richard's side here, 3 Bow of Nylea, 3 Mistcritter Hydras, a Nylea's Disciple, 2 Reclamation Sages, that's a new one, Abrupt Decay, a Doomblade, a Golgari Charm, 2 Future Revise, a Vraska, and 2 copies of Rakdos Return. I think you're going to see the Rakdos Returns come in, the copies of Reclamation Sage. This is sort of replacing Golgari Charm to some extent, just some enchantment and also artifact removal that the deck gets access to at a pretty efficient rate. Also something you can fight off with Domri, which is a nice bonus. And I think the Abrupt Decay will come in, and the Vraska. This is interesting here, because you see these Pithing Needles in Joe's sideboard. It wouldn't surprise me. You got this plan against Jund Monsters. We're leaping ahead a little bit here of.
Yeah.
Well, I want Detention Spheres for Planeswalkers. I know my opponent's going to bring in Golgari Charm after board. So I get rid of the Detention Spheres. I bring in Pithing Needle, so I can still answer the Planeswalkers and not run my answer into Golgari Charm, which is a pretty good structure. But if the card they have now is Reclamation Sage instead of Abrupt Decay, or Golgari Charm rather, it doesn't work nearly as well.
It doesn't matter. And I kind of wonder whether or not Joe has to go on this plan of creatures. If you look at Richey's sideboard, I mean, so you said Reclamation Sage, Mistcutter Hydra, Abrupt Decay, Vraska, Rakdos' Return. It's like 9, 10 cards. 10 cards of his sideboard are all really good in this matchup. Richey's improving his deck a fair amount here.
Yeah, and he gets to make some really easy cuts. I mean, 2 copies of Mizium Mortars, 2 copies of Ultimate Price, those are easy to take out. And then, you know, some number of the, you know, I don't know if you want all the Scavenging Oozes, all the copies of Corset Groupix, all the Sylvan Caryatids. There's a lot of easy cuts for this deck to make.
Yeah, it's, you know, these 3-color mid-range decks have always been great at sideboarding, and then this is no exception.
It's the biggest bonus to playing these decks, I feel like, is usually you have about a half dozen cards in your deck that are bad against beatdown decks, about a half dozen cards in your deck that are bad against control decks, and in your sideboard you get, you know, a half dozen haymakers for each matchup. You get to cut out the bad cards and bring in substantially better cards. I think the Rakdos, or the Jund rather mid-range deck that you talked about earlier, to me, the biggest incentive to play that deck was the sideboard was incredible. I mean, all your matchups got so much better. Some of your game ones were pretty rough as a result of this, but your post-board matchups across the board were excellent. And I think that's a benefit of decks that people don't really look at when they're reading deck lists. They just see, okay, there's some, you know, some kill spells and some discard spells in the sideboard, whatever, not a big deal. But the sum of the total 75 is huge when it gets to play most matchups.
Yeah, so by and large, it seems like whether it's monsters or mid-range, like Jund colors in general have excellent sideboarding options. I'm not sure what it is like about those colors that, you know, as opposed to say blue or white decks, but it does seem like, you know, whether all these Jund decks have great sideboards.
Well, I think you get access to a variety of cheap removal, a variety of good creatures, a variety of good discard spells. Enchantment and artifact removal exist in those 2 colors. It's hard to find a problem that you can't answer when you're playing Jund colors.
That's definitely true. Lossett on the play. We're on game 2 here. A quick game 1 off Richey from Richey. Basic, and it wasn't that Lossett's hand was that bad. He played a couple Domries, and they got detention sphered. And it seemed like Joe missed a land drop and then was dead pretty quickly.
For blue-white, for example, you are often going to be lacking good cheap removal. That's just something that doesn't really exist in those 2 colors very often.
Right.
So when you're sideboarding, you have to go to things like Nyx's Fleece Ram or Ratchet Bomb. None of those cards are bad, but it's not as good as being able to bring in, you know, Magma Sprays, let's say. It's not the same level of efficiency.
I think the biggest weakness of the blue-white decks in Standard right now are that they don't have a 1-mana card. You know, to play 2 spells in a turn, it's going to cost you 4 mana, and it's going to have to be good mana. Right? There's no outs. There's no path to exile. There's no anything you can really do. The oust would be great in the deck.
Yeah, just the games I play against control decks, Esper or blue-white, when they're on the draw, I feel like I'm just going to run this person out of the gym before they even get anything going, because there's nothing happening on the first turn.
Yeah. So, Lossett starts out on 2 temples. We do see an Archangel of Thune hiding out in his hand. Richey's on a mulligan here. He does have a turn 2 Elvish Mystic. The one thing is that when your opponent doesn't run you out of the gym, however, these Revelation decks are very powerful.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you have to have a cohesive game plan, and you have to win quickly because the raw power of all the cards is so high.
All right, well, Richey has a turn 3 Polukranos. It's good, but I can't imagine it's strong enough. Again, not knowing what's in Joe's hand, I don't think he's going to be too worried about it.
He has a lot of Archangels, it looks like.
I think he has 3 Archangel of Thunes.
And he has the combo with Blind Obedience.
Oh, wow. So,
Which
no one has stored the second one?
No one has ever beaten that, for the record. It is undefeated as far as I know.
Yeah, we see a Jace in his hand, 3 Archangel of Thunes. He's debating on a Scry here. I'd have to think, well, priority 1 is, do you have land 5? How soon can we cast these Archangels?
Yeah, he does not have a land in his hand. He was looking at Ultimate Price there, which is an excellent draw, but Joe decides, I just need land drops at this point. So even though Ultimate Price is good, it's not what I'm looking for right now.
Yeah, Polukranos knocks Lossett down to 15. And we'll see what else Richey can do. It's going to be a 5-mana spell, and that's going to be Mistcutter, the all post-combat Mistcutter Hydra. Lossett's going to need a land now, or a Supreme Verdict. And, oh, what a dagger. It is a land, but it's a Temple of Deceit. So that's going to come into play tapped.
That's a pretty risky miscutter there from Richard because for all he knows, Joe could have Supreme Verdict in hand. There's, he could have had just the fourth land that was coming to play tap there. I suppose he has 2 Mutavaults to recover with regardless, and it puts Joe in a ton of trouble if he doesn't have Supreme Verdict, but that was a risky play there from Richard. Maybe his hand just doesn't allow him to do anything else, but.
Yeah, better check your opponent on that Supreme Verdict. That's your best shot of winning. We do see Jace in Joe's hand. We may see him play Jace and plus it to gain 2. I wouldn't be surprised to see that. But right now, Joe is he doesn't actually have time starting next turn to start casting Archangels. They're gonna be chump blocking if he does.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, he needs to play Supreme Verdict. I would wonder whether you'd play Jace minus it to find a Verdict. As gross as that sounds.
Because the plus doesn't get him anywhere.
Right.
Richard can just say, I'll animate Mutavault, I'll send Palachronos and a Mutavault at Jace.
I think he minuses it. Right? He needs Verdict.
Although he's taking, there's 14 on board right now too. So Verdict doesn't even get him out of this because of the 2 Mutavaults. If Richard just goes untap, turn on my 2 Mutavaults, attack you for 14, your turn. Now Supreme Verdict doesn't even work.
Right. So he's gonna have to plus it.
Maybe. Joe's in rock and a hard place territory right now.
He needs to top deck Supreme Verdict.
And these 2 Mutavaults, there's only 2 in the list, but they've been a big part of the problem Joe's been having in these games.
He's going to go ahead and plus the Jace. All right.
Yeah, I think this is the play Joe ultimately needs to make because he does not have outs otherwise.
Stomping Ground, untapped for Richey. That's certainly a scary one for Lossett. And I think Rakdos's return.
Oh, boy.
For 4, and Joe is done.
Wow. Not a shabby draw there from Richard, I would say.
Yeah, 2-0. Richey makes quick work of Joe Lossett. He moves to 2-0. Joe will be down to 1-1.
Find a backup match, and then we will cut to break after whatever our backup match is over. Yeah, that was just a dominant performance on what Jund Monsters is capable of doing. With the right draws. Again, game 1 had to be pretty Planeswalker oriented, I felt like, given the quality of Joe's hand, but and Joe's hand game 2 was pretty bad. I mean,